Welcome to Pod Top 10 Secret, where the most terrifying mysteries are revealed. When the sun sets and darkness engulfs the deep forests, they become a realm of haunting secrets. Among the rustling leaves and faint footsteps in the shadows lie ghost stories that will send chills down your spine. Today, we invite you to explore Top 10 Most Chilling Ghost Stories from the Deep Woods, where every whisper might be a call from the other side, and every path leads to a haunting mystery. Brace yourself, because the nightmares lurking in the dark are about to begin. Story 1. The Blood Spirit of the Dark Forest. The Dark Wood Forest, located on the outskirts of a small village in a remote valley, had long been known as a place no one dared to enter, especially at night. Even during the day, sunlight struggled to pierce through the thick canopy of trees, creating an eerie and oppressive atmosphere. The villagers often whispered about the legend of a vengeful ghost they called the Blood Spirit. According to the village elders, over a century ago, a woman named Evelyn Hart lived in this area. Evelyn was a beautiful but outcast woman, falsely accused of witchcraft by the townspeople. They tied her up, beat her, and finally burned her alive in the depths of the forest. Before she died, Evelyn cursed the land, vowing never to rest until she exacted her revenge. Since then, anyone who dared step foot into the forest mysteriously disappeared or was found in a grotesque state, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. Villagers often spoke of hearing wailing cries echoing from the woods on moonless nights, or catching glimpses of a pale woman with long black hair and glowing red eyes. One cold winter night, under a starless sky shrouded in heavy fog, a group of 4 young villagers decided to confront the curse and uncover the truth. They were skeptics, firm believers that the stories were mere folklore. Armed with flashlights, machetes, and a video camera, they ventured into Darkwood Forest. At first, the forest was eerily quiet. There were no sounds of birds, no chirping insects, only the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. The deeper they went, the weaker their flashlight beams became, as though the darkness was swallowing the light. Suddenly, strange whispers surrounded them. It sounded like dozens of voices murmuring simultaneously, though none of the words were intelligible. Logan, the leader of the group, froze in his tracks. He pointed ahead. In the dim glow of the flashlight, they saw a figure standing motionless. It was a woman, her long black hair concealing most of her face, wearing a blood-stained white dress. Fear began to creep into their hearts, but before they could turn and run, the woman raised her head. Her glowing red eyes burned into theirs, and her mouth stretched into a grotesque, twisted smile, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. The woman lunged at Logan with inhuman speed. His terrified scream pierced the forest, only to be abruptly cut short by a sickening sound. The others turned and fled in panic, but each step felt heavier, as though the forest itself was trying to trap them. Mia, one of the group members, was suddenly yanked to the ground. The others turned back just in time to see the pale hand of the woman dragging Mia into a dark pit. Her screams echoed for only a moment before being swallowed by an eerie silence. The remaining 2, Alex and Ryan, ran as fast as they could. They thought they had reached safety when they saw the edge of the forest. But instead of the village, they found themselves in an entirely different place. The forest seemed darker, colder, and more oppressive, as if they had crossed into another realm. In front of them, the Blood Spirit reappeared, now towering over them with blood dripping from her face and deep cuts running across her skin. Alex dropped to his knees, begging for mercy, while Ryan, overcome with despair, pulled out a knife and plunged it into his own chest to escape the terror. The Blood Spirit approached Alex, her icy hand caressing his face. His eyes widened in horror, but his body was paralyzed. When the villagers found Alex the next morning, his face was twisted in a grotesque expression of fear, his eyes still wide open as though he had stared into the abyss. From that day on, Darkwood Forest seemed to come alive. The wailing cries from the forest grew louder, lasting until dawn. A week later, the villagers discovered a message carved into a large stone near the forest's edge. The blood spirit has returned. Beware. No one dared to enter the forest again, but at night, a few villagers began reporting the same nightmare. A pale woman with long black hair and glowing red eyes, standing outside their windows, smiling. Story 2. The Curse of the Wailing Phantom. The legend of Evelyn Harper, also known as the Wailing Phantom, is not just a tale to scare children, but a nightmare woven into the fabric of the Darkwood Forest. Evelyn was once a kind-hearted woman who lived in the village on the forest's edge in the late 1800s. She was known for her healing abilities, using herbs and remedies from the forest. However, her beauty and talents drew envy from others, particularly the village elder's wife, who accused her of witchcraft after a mysterious illness spread through the village. The villagers, driven by fear and ignorance, captured Evelyn and dragged her into the forest. They tied her to an ancient tree at the heart of the woods, a place believed to harbor dark spirits. Evelyn pleaded for mercy, but her cries were drowned out by the chanting of the mob. They set fire to the tree, burning her alive. As the flames consumed her, Evelyn screamed a curse. "This forest shall be my home, and all who enter shall know my pain. Your souls are mine." From that day forward, the forest became a place of dread. People began disappearing without a trace, and those who ventured too deep were found dead, their faces twisted in terror. The villagers eventually abandoned the area, leaving it to the curse and the restless spirit of Evelyn. A century later, the village had become a ghost town, but the forest still drew the curious and the reckless. Among them was Jessica Morgan, a paranormal investigator and skeptic. Jessica had made a career out of debunking supernatural myths, but the legend of the Wailing Phantom intrigued her. Determined to uncover the truth, she gathered a team of 3 friends: David, a cameraman, Lisa, a historian, and Mark, an audio specialist. Armed with advanced equipment, they entered the forest on a cold, moonless night. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was icy, and an unnatural silence enveloped the group. Even the rustling of leaves and the chirping of insects were absent. Lisa began recounting the legend of Evelyn, her voice trembling as she described the horrific details of Evelyn's death. Mark, trying to lighten the mood, joked about ghosts, but his laugh echoed strangely, as if the forest were mocking him. Suddenly, the group's audio equipment picked up a faint whisper. It was unintelligible at first, but as they adjusted the settings, the voice grew clearer. "Leave, now, or stay forever." Jessica, refusing to be intimidated, insisted they continue. They set up their equipment near the center of the forest, where the tree Evelyn was burned on once stood. The tree was now a charred husk, its blackened branches reaching skyward like claws. As they began recording, the temperature plummeted and an otherworldly fog rolled in, obscuring their surroundings. The whispers grew louder, and then came the sound of footsteps circling them. David swung his camera around, but the fog made it impossible to see. Then they heard it, a blood-curdling scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A shadow emerged from the fog. It was Evelyn. Her hollow eyes locked onto Jessica, and her mouth opened in an inhuman wail. Lisa screamed and tried to run, but she tripped over an exposed root. Evelyn descended upon her, her skeletal hands gripping Lisa's face. The team watched in horror as Lisa's skin began to wither, her screams fading into silence. When Evelyn released her, Lisa's lifeless body crumpled to the ground, her face frozen in a grotesque expression of terror. Jessica shouted for the group to retreat, but the forest seemed to conspire against them. The paths they had taken were gone, replaced by a labyrinth of twisted trees. Mark, clutching his audio recorder, began muttering to himself, his voice growing louder and more frantic. Suddenly, he turned to the group with blood pouring from his eyes and ears, his body convulsing before collapsing. David and Jessica were the only ones left. Desperately trying to escape, they ran through the fog, but Evelyn followed them. Her figure seemed to glide above the ground, her long, bony fingers reaching out. David tripped and fell, his camera skidding away. Evelyn loomed over him, and for a moment, he thought she might spare him. But then her face split open into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. She plunged her hand into his chest, pulling out his still-beating heart as his screams echoed into the void. Jessica, now alone, stumbled upon an old chapel buried deep in the forest. She ran inside and barricaded the door. The chapel was decrepit, its walls covered in symbols she didn't recognize. At the center was a book, its pages yellowed with age. Desperately flipping through it, she found a passage describing how to banish vengeful spirits. The ritual required her own blood and the burning of the cursed tree. With no other choice, Jessica cut her palm and dripped her blood onto the book. The symbols on the walls began to glow, and the ground trembled. Evelyn's wails grew louder, and Jessica knew she was coming. Grabbing a torch from the chapel, she sprinted back to the tree. Evelyn appeared before her, her skeletal face twisted with rage. Jessica lit the tree on fire, but Evelyn lunged at her, slamming her into the ground. The fire consumed the tree, and Evelyn let out an ear-piercing shriek as her body began to disintegrate. Just as Jessica thought she had succeeded, Evelyn's spirit exploded in a burst of darkness, enveloping Jessica. Days later, a group of hikers found Jessica's body near the charred remains of the tree. Her face was pale, her eyes wide open, and her mouth twisted into a silent scream. Clutched in her hand was the book from the chapel, its pages now blank. The hikers reported strange occurrences afterward. Whispers in the wind, cold spots, and glimpses of a woman in white. The legend of Evelyn Harper lived on, but now it carried a new warning. Jessica's voice could sometimes be heard in the forest, begging anyone who dared to enter to turn back before it was too late. The curse had not ended. It had simply evolved, and the Wailing Phantom now had a new accomplice. Jessica. Together, their cries echoed through the darkwood forest, ensuring no soul would ever escape. Story 3. The Graveyard Keeper. The night sky was swallowed by thick fog, with the pale, full moon peeking weakly behind gray clouds. The Old Moon Graveyard, a place villagers had avoided for centuries, was shrouded in deadly silence. Weathered, cracked gravestones, gnarled, lifeless trees, and the distant cries of crows created an eerie, hellish atmosphere. Here, the legend of the Graveyard Keeper was passed down through generations. A towering, skeletal, immortal figure who guarded the eternal rest of the dead and punished anyone daring to disturb this sacred ground. Tonight, 4 young friends decided to challenge the legend. Jack, the leader of the group, was fearless. Accompanying him were Sarah, a curious but apprehensive girl, Mike, the joker of the group, and Tom, the timid one. They carried flashlights, a camera, and a phone to document their adventure. None of them believed in the legend. To them, this was nothing but a thrilling dare. The heavy, rusted iron gate of the graveyard creaked loudly as Jack pushed it open, the sound echoing unnervingly in the still air. They stepped inside, and immediately, the atmosphere shifted. The wind stopped blowing. No crows cawed, no insects buzzed. There was only a suffocating, oppressive silence. Sarah shivered as a cold chill ran down her spine. "Are you sure we should be here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "There's nothing to be scared of," Jack replied with a grin. "It's just some old graves." But deep down, even Jack felt something wasn't right. As they ventured deeper, the gravestones emerged from the mist, their inscriptions weathered and moss-covered. Mike shone his flashlight on one and burst out laughing. Hey, look, this guy's name is the same as mine. His laughter quickly died when Sarah pointed to another gravestone. My name is here too. The group froze. On the ancient, crumbling headstones were their names, along with their birth dates and their death dates, the very day they had entered the graveyard. Their playful banter was replaced by a heavy, crushing fear. Just then, a cold wind howled through the graveyard, carrying faint, distant whispers. Tom clutched Sarah's arm, his face pale. We have to leave. Now. But the path they had come through was gone. The familiar trails were now enveloped in a dense fog, and their flashlight beams failed to pierce the darkness, as though the very air was swallowing the light. And then, from afar, a sound echoed, the clinking of chains dragging across the ground. What? What is that? Sarah whispered. A towering shadow emerged from the mist. The graveyard keeper. He stood nearly 10 feet tall, skeletal and menacing, his tattered cloak seeming to merge with the darkness itself. His face was a hollow skull, his empty eye sockets emitting an eerie, faint glow. In one bony hand, he held a massive scythe, its blade dripping with black, viscous liquid that stained the ground beneath him. Run! Jack shouted. The group fled in terror, their footsteps pounding against the frozen ground. But the graveyard keeper didn't chase them. He didn't need to. With each slow, deliberate step he took, the very air around them twisted and warped. The ground split open, and skeletal hands clawed upward, reaching for the fleeing friends. Sarah screamed as one of the hands caught her ankle, pulling her down. Jack grabbed her and yanked her free, the two of them stumbling forward. What the hell is going on? Mike shouted, his voice breaking. Tom glanced back and saw the graveyard keeper approaching, his every movement deliberate and unhurried. Around him, ghostly apparitions materialized, their hollow eyes and outstretched hands closing in on the group. They found an old underground crypt and scrambled inside, slamming the heavy door shut behind them. Inside, the air was icy, and their flashlights illuminated walls covered in ancient carvings. On a table in the center of the crypt lay a dusty, leather-bound journal. Jack grabbed the journal and flipped through its pages. The handwriting was messy and erratic. I am the last of this cursed village. To seal the evil, I sacrificed my soul, becoming the graveyard keeper. But should the seal be broken, no one will survive. In his panic, Mike accidentally touched a strange, rusted medallion lying next to the journal. The medallion began to glow, and the entire crypt trembled. Screams erupted from the walls as ghostly figures burst forth, their twisted faces howling in torment. One of them seized Mike, dragging him into the darkness. His terrified cries echoed, then abruptly stopped. The graveyard keeper appeared at the entrance of the crypt, his empty eye sockets glowing brighter. He raised his massive scythe and struck the ground. The impact sent shockwaves through the crypt, shattering the walls and scattering the group. Jack, Sarah, and Tom ran, but one by one, they were swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Ghostly hands emerged to drag them into the earth, their screams fading into silence. As dawn approached, the graveyard returned to its eerie stillness. The gravestones now bore 4 new names: Jack, Sarah, Mike, and Tom. The graveyard keeper stood silently among the graves, his hollow eyes gazing out into the distance. The faint clinking of his chains echoed once more, a chilling reminder of his eternal vigil. In the nearby village, no one ever heard from the 4 friends again. But on nights of the full moon, the villagers swore they could hear the faint whispers of ghosts and the heavy footsteps of the graveyard keeper, forever guarding the cursed graveyard. Story 4: The Bride of Shadows. The small village of Hollow Creek had always been shrouded in mystery. At its outskirts lay a dense, twisted forest where no one dared to venture after dark. Deep within this forest stood an abandoned chapel, its walls crumbling and overgrown with ivy. Legends whispered of a cursed bride who haunted its grounds, a woman wronged in life and now vowing eternal vengeance in death. Her name had been Eleanor, once the most beautiful woman in Hollow Creek. On her wedding day, dressed in a flowing white gown, she had waited in the chapel for her groom, Thomas, who never came. Betrayed and humiliated, Eleanor fled into the forest, where she was never seen alive again. Some said she had been killed by wild animals. Others believed her grief had driven her to madness. But whatever happened that fateful night, her spirit never found peace. It was a moonless night when a group of 5 friends, Eric, Lily, Tom, Rachel, and Brian, gathered around a campfire on the edge of Hollow Creek. Fueled by alcohol and arrogance, Eric proposed a dare. "Let's see who's brave enough to find the chapel," he said with a smirk. "They say if you stay there until midnight, you'll see her, the Bride of Shadows." Lily shivered, her eyes darting toward the dark line of trees. "That's not funny, Eric. People say she's real." "Oh, come on," Eric scoffed. "It's just a story." Despite their unease, the group agreed to the dare. They laughed nervously as they entered the forest, their flashlights barely cutting through the dense fog that seemed to rise from the ground. The journey through the forest was unnerving. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. Only the crunch of their footsteps on dead leaves broke the silence. When they reached the chapel, it was worse than they imagined. The building loomed before them like a skeletal corpse, its windows shattered, its doors hanging askew. A cold wind blew through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. "Looks like no one's home," Brian joked, though his voice betrayed his fear. As they stepped inside, the air grew colder. The chapel's interior was a mess of broken pews and rotting wood. At the front, where the altar once stood, was a single veil, tattered and yellowed with age. Rachel reached out to touch it, but Lily grabbed her arm. "Don't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We shouldn't disturb anything." Eric rolled his eyes. "It's just a piece of cloth." He snatched it up and laughed, draping it over his head. "Look at me, I'm the Bride of Shadows." The others laughed nervously, but the laughter died abruptly when the temperature plummeted. Their breath fogged the air, and a faint, otherworldly sobbing echoed through the chapel. The sobbing grew louder, transforming into a guttural wail that seemed to come from all around them. The friends huddled together, their flashlights flickering. Then they saw her. She emerged from the shadows at the far end of the chapel. Her gown, once white, was now stained with dirt and decay. Her veil flowed like mist around her skeletal face, her hollow eyes staring straight at them. Her hands, gnarled and claw-like, reached out as she glided forward. Rachel screamed and ran, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. The bride's head tilted unnaturally, her jaw opening wide as if to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, the sobbing turned to laughter, cold, cruel, and filled with malice. "You came to mock me," she hissed, her voice echoing in their heads. "Now you will share my pain." One by one, the friends were separated, the bride's laughter chasing them through the crumbling chapel. Lily tripped and fell, and when she looked up, the bride was inches away, her skeletal hands caressing Lily's face. "Your fear is delicious," she whispered before plunging her clawed fingers into Lily's chest. Lily screamed, then went silent. Eric, who had mocked her, was the next to fall. The veil he had mocked so brazenly now wrapped around his throat, tightening until he could no longer breathe. His lifeless body collapsed to the floor. Tom and Rachel found themselves cornered near the altar. The bride loomed over them, her empty eyes glowing faintly. "Do you know what it feels like to be betrayed? To die alone?" she demanded. Without waiting for an answer, she raised her hands, and the walls of the chapel seemed to close in, trapping them in eternal darkness. Brian, the last survivor, stumbled outside, gasping for air. He thought he was safe until he heard the bride's voice whispering in his ear, "You can never leave me." The forest swallowed him whole. The next day, the villagers found the chapel empty, but the veil was back on the altar, stained with fresh blood. No trace of the 5 friends was ever found, but their laughter, their screams, and the bride's haunting wail could still be heard on moonless nights. And so, the legend of the Bride of Shadows lived on, her spirit forever bound to the chapel, waiting for the next fools to enter her domain. Story 5. The Lurker of the Crypt. In a desolate corner of Black Hollow Cemetery, where broken tombstones leaned precariously and ancient trees stretched their skeletal branches toward the sky, stood a crumbling mausoleum. Locals called it the Crypt of the Devourer, a name that sent shivers through even the bravest souls. They spoke in hushed tones about the creature that dwelled within, a hideous, immortal entity that feasted on those foolish enough to disturb its slumber. No one knew when the legend began, but it was said that centuries ago, a cruel witch had cursed the land. She had been executed for unspeakable crimes, her body buried deep beneath the crypt. But death had not silenced her. Instead, it had transformed her into something far worse. An abomination with sharp claws, gnashing teeth, and eyes that glowed with unholy hunger. On a stormy autumn night, a group of teenagers, Chris, Emily, Tyler, and Mia, gathered near the cemetery. They were thrill-seekers, chasing urban legends and supernatural tales. Chris, the group leader, had heard of the crypt and proposed they explore it. "Come on," he said, holding up his phone to record the moment. "We'll get a ton of views. Who wouldn't want to see us explore the infamous Crypt of the Devourer?" Emily hesitated, glancing at the cemetery gates swaying in the wind. "You've heard the stories, right? People who go in there don't come back." Tyler laughed. "Stories to scare kids. There's no such thing as monsters." Mia, the quietest of the group, finally spoke. "Maybe there's a reason no one comes back." Despite their unease, curiosity won out, and they climbed over the cemetery gate, flashlights cutting through the thick fog. The mausoleum loomed before them, its facade cracked and weathered, its iron doors ajar as if inviting them inside. Lightning illuminated the grotesque carvings above the entrance. Skulls, serpents, and what appeared to be the figure of a woman with claws instead of hands. Inside, the air was heavy with the stench of decay. The walls were lined with niches holding broken urns and bones. At the center of the crypt was a massive stone sarcophagus, its lid slightly askew. "This is it," Chris whispered, aiming his camera at the sarcophagus. "The witch's tomb." Mia shivered, her instincts screaming at her to leave. "We shouldn't be here." Chris ignored her, pushing the lid of the sarcophagus aside with Tyler's help. Dust and cobwebs billowed into the air, revealing a deep, dark cavity. At its center lay a grotesque figure, a corpse that should have been long decayed, yet its flesh clung to its bones in a sickening, leathery way. Its mouth was frozen in a snarl, jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. Emily gasped. "It's real." The crypt suddenly vibrated as if the earth itself was groaning in protest. The corpse's eyes snapped open, glowing an unnatural blue. A guttural growl erupted, and the creature rose from the sarcophagus, its long, clawed fingers curling like a predator preparing to strike. The teenagers screamed, backing away, but the creature was faster. It leapt from the sarcophagus, its claws slicing through the air. Tyler was the first to fall, his cry of terror cut short as the creature's claws tore into him, dragging him into the shadows. "Run!" Chris shouted, grabbing Emily's hand. The group fled deeper into the crypt, the creature's raspy breaths and guttural growls echoing behind them. The walls seemed to close in, the passages twisting and turning as if the crypt itself was alive, conspiring to trap them. Mia tripped and fell, her flashlight rolling away. She scrambled to her feet, but the creature loomed over her, its maw stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You disturbed my slumber," it hissed, its voice a chilling blend of rage and hunger. "Now you shall feed me." Her scream was lost in the cacophony of thunder outside. Chris and Emily burst into a small chamber, slamming the door behind them. The room was filled with ancient symbols carved into the walls, a faint blue glow emanating from the floor. In the center was a pedestal holding a rusted dagger. Emily's eyes widened. "It's a sealing dagger. The villagers must have used it to trap her." Before they could act, the door shattered and the creature lunged inside. Emily grabbed the dagger and thrust it toward the creature, but it swatted her aside with monstrous strength, sending her crashing into the wall. Chris grabbed the dagger and drove it into the creature's chest. It shrieked, its body writhing as blue light erupted from the wound. For a moment, Chris thought they had won. But the creature didn't die. Instead, it laughed, pulling the dagger from its chest as the wound sealed itself. "You cannot kill me," it snarled. "I am eternal." The last thing Chris saw was the creature's glowing eyes and razor-sharp teeth descending upon him. When dawn broke, the cemetery was silent once more. The crypt stood as it always had, untouched, as if no one had entered. The villagers found no trace of the teenagers, only the shattered gate and the faint sound of laughter carried on the wind. But some nights, under the glow of a full moon, passers-by claimed they could hear the growls and screams of those who dared to awaken the devourer. And deep within the crypt, her eyes still glowed, waiting for her next feast. Story 6. The Ghost in Room 306. It was nearly midnight when Emma checked into the decrepit old motel on the outskirts of town. Exhausted from a long day of traveling, she hardly paid attention to the peeling wallpaper or the dim flicker of the overhead lights in the lobby. The motel manager, an older man with a nervous demeanor, handed her the key with trembling hands. "You're in room 306, he said, avoiding her eyes. "Just try not to make too much noise. And if you hear anything strange, don't open the door." Emma raised an eyebrow but shrugged it off. She was too tired to question his odd behavior. With her suitcase in tow, she climbed the creaking staircase and walked down the dimly lit hallway. Room 306 was at the very end, its door slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for her. The room was plain but serviceable. A bed with a faded quilt, a small desk, and a single window shrouded by heavy curtains. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and carried a faint scent of mildew. Emma locked the door, threw her bag on the bed, and collapsed onto the mattress without bothering to change. As she lay there, the silence of the room became oppressive. It wasn't the comforting quiet of solitude, but a heavy stillness that made her chest tighten. From the corner of her eye, she thought she saw movement, a shadow flitting across the room. She sat up, her pulse quickening, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "It's just my imagination," she muttered, lying back down. But then came the sound, a faint, raspy whisper. "Emma." Her eyes flew open. She sat up again, staring into the darkness. "Hello? Is someone there?" she called, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Get out." Emma's heart pounded as she grabbed her phone to use as a flashlight. She scanned the room, the beam of light trembling in her shaking hands. The shadows seemed to dance on the walls, and the cold grew more intense. She approached the closet, the only place someone could possibly be hiding, and yanked it open. Empty. She exhaled shakily and turned back toward the bed, only to freeze in terror. Standing by the window was a woman. Her long black hair hung like a veil over her pale, skeletal face, her hollow eyes staring directly at Emma. She wore a tattered white gown, the fabric stained and frayed. Her lips, blackened and cracked, stretched into a menacing grin, revealing sharp, discolored teeth. Emma stumbled backward, dropping her phone. The woman moved closer, her bare feet gliding soundlessly across the floor. Her hands, claw-like and bony, reached out as she whispered again. "You shouldn't have come." Emma's scream caught in her throat as the figure lunged at her. She bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock as cold, invisible hands seemed to grip her shoulders. Finally, she managed to fling the door open and ran down the hallway, her breath ragged and tears streaming down her face. She burst into the lobby where the manager was still sitting at the desk. He looked up, startled, as Emma collapsed in front of him. "She's in there," Emma cried. "In room 306. There's someone in there." The man's face went pale. He shook his head slowly. "You saw her?" Emma nodded, her entire body trembling. "Who is she? What's going on?" The manager hesitated, then leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not the first. That room, it's cursed. Years ago, a woman named Margaret stayed there. Her husband abandoned her on their wedding night, leaving her to spend the night alone in that room. She hanged herself by the window. Ever since, she's been trapped there, lashing out at anyone who disturbs her." "Why didn't you warn me?" Emma shouted, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and anger. "I tried," the manager said weakly. "But it doesn't matter. Once you've seen her, she doesn't let you leave." Emma didn't wait to hear more. She grabbed her car keys and bolted out of the lobby, sprinting to her car in the empty parking lot. She threw her suitcase into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors. Her hands trembled as she turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and she peeled out of the parking lot, speeding down the dark road. But no matter how far she drove, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. Her rearview mirror reflected only the dark road behind her, until it didn't. In the mirror, she saw the woman, Margaret, sitting in the back seat, her lifeless eyes fixed on Emma. The car swerved as Emma screamed, losing control. The last thing she saw before everything went black was Margaret's twisted grin. The next morning, the police found Emma's car overturned in a ditch, but there was no sign of her body. Back at the motel, the manager quietly locked room 306, muttering a prayer under his breath. But he knew it wouldn't be long before someone else checked in, drawn by the cheap rates and unaware of the dark secret lurking within. And Margaret waited, her hollow eyes watching from the window, hungry for her next visitor. Story 7. The Witch's Kitchen. It was Halloween night, and the air was heavy with the scent of burning leaves and the chill of an approaching storm. Lily and her friends, Mark, Sarah, and Jason, wandered through the outskirts of their small town, searching for a thrill. Their goal was to find the infamous Hollow Hearth, a decrepit house shrouded in tales of witchcraft and dark rituals. Rumor had it that centuries ago, a witch named Agatha lived there, conducting sinister spells and brewing potions that cursed the land. One Halloween night, the townsfolk stormed her home and burned her alive. But as she perished, she swore vengeance. Her house, they said, remained frozen in time, waiting for the foolish and the curious to stumble upon it. The group stumbled upon the house by accident, or so it seemed. A winding dirt path led them to a sagging structure cloaked in shadows, its windows glowing faintly as though lit from within. The air grew colder as they approached, and an eerie silence descended. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. "Do you see that?" Sarah whispered, pointing to the windows. The faint orange glow flickered like candlelight. "It's just someone playing a prank," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. Jason smirked. "Prank or not, we came for a scare. Let's check it out." Lily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But not wanting to be the only coward, she followed her friends up the creaking porch steps. The door creaked open with an unsettling ease, revealing a dimly lit interior. The group stepped inside, their flashlights casting long shadows on the warped wooden walls. Cobwebs hung in thick silken sheets, and the scent of wax and decay permeated the air. They followed the faint glow to a kitchen that looked like something out of a nightmare. Dozens of jack-o'-lanterns lined the counters and shelves, their carved faces leering in the candlelight. The table in the center was covered in a blackened cloth, and a bubbling cauldron sat on the stove, emitting a sickly green glow. At the head of the table stood a woman. Her long, platinum hair cascaded over her pale shoulders, and her hollow eyes glinted with malice. She was beautiful in a haunting, unnatural way, her lips curling into a cold smile as she regarded the intruders. "Welcome," she said, her voice smooth and chilling. "You've come just in time for dinner." Mark stepped forward, trying to mask his fear. "Who are you? Is this some kind of Halloween stunt?" The woman tilted her head, her smile widening. "I'm Agatha," she said simply. "And this is my home." Jason laughed nervously. "The Agatha? The witch? That's not possible. You've been dead for..." "Centuries?" she interrupted, her tone mocking. "And yet, here I am. Death is but a doorway, children. One you foolishly opened." The candles around the room flared brighter, their flames twisting unnaturally. The cauldron began to bubble violently, and the air grew thick with the scent of sulfur. Agatha raised a hand, and the door behind them slammed shut. "You entered uninvited," she said, her voice now a low growl. "And for that, you must pay." Panic set in as the group scrambled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Mark grabbed a chair and hurled it at a window, only to watch in horror as the glass rippled like water and reformed. The jack-o'-lanterns seemed to turn their leering faces toward them, their carved grins twisting into grotesque sneers. Agatha began chanting in a language none of them understood. Her voice echoed in the small kitchen, and the shadows on the walls stretched and writhed as though alive. One by one, the candles extinguished, leaving only the sickly green glow of the cauldron to light the room. Sarah screamed as something cold and slimy wrapped around her ankle. She looked down to see a blackened skeletal hand reaching up from the floorboards. More hands emerged, clawing at the group, dragging them toward the center of the room. Lily grabbed a candlestick and swung it at the hands, but it passed through them like smoke. "What do you want from us?" she shouted, tears streaming down her face. Agatha paused her chant, her hollow eyes locking onto Lily. "I want what was taken from me. Life. Youth. You entered my domain, and now your souls are mine." Jason, in a desperate attempt to distract her, lunged at the cauldron and tipped it over. The green liquid spilled across the floor, hissing and steaming, but instead of weakening Agatha, it seemed to invigorate her. She threw back her head and laughed, her form growing taller and more menacing. "You cannot fight me," she hissed. "You cannot escape." In a moment of clarity, Lily noticed a dagger lying on the table, ornate, ancient, and glowing faintly with a blue light. She grabbed it and, without thinking, lunged at Agatha. The blade pierced the witch's chest, and for a moment, everything went still. Agatha screamed, her body convulsing as black smoke poured from the wound. The shadows in the room shrieked and retreated, and the skeletal hands released their grip on the group. The candles reignited, their light chasing away the oppressive darkness. But Agatha wasn't finished. She grabbed Lily by the throat, her hollow eyes burning with fury. "You cannot destroy me," she rasped. "I will return." With a final, desperate scream, Lily twisted the dagger, and Agatha's body disintegrated into ash. The room fell silent. The group stumbled out of the house, the door now swinging open as if mocking them. The air outside was crisp and quiet, the storm clouds dissipating. They didn't speak as they walked back to town, their faces pale and their hands trembling. But as they reached the edge of the woods, Lily stopped. She turned back toward the house, her heart sinking as she saw the faint orange glow of candles reigniting in the windows. Agatha's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, a chilling reminder that some evils never truly die. Story 8. The Dance of Life and Death. In a forgotten realm where time stood still, two eternal beings ruled in a delicate balance. Life was radiant, her beauty enchanting, and her presence a source of endless joy. She walked among mortals, her touch bringing laughter, love, and hope. Her hair flowed like golden rivers, her gown shimmering with the colors of dawn. Everywhere she went, people adored her, celebrated her, and begged for her blessings. But trailing silently behind her was death. Clad in a dark cloak that swallowed the light, his skeletal frame carried a scythe that gleamed with the weight of inevitability. His gaze was cold, his presence unyielding. Unlike life, he was neither adored nor welcomed. Mortals recoiled from him, their hearts filled with fear and hatred at the mere whisper of his name. Yet he was always there, watching, waiting, for he was the inevitable end to all life one evening, as the sun set over the mortal world, casting the skies in hues of crimson and gold. Life turned to death. The two stood at the edge of a great meadow, watching humans revel in laughter and song. Children played, lovers embraced, and families shared warm meals under the fading light. "Tell me, Death," Life said softly, her voice like the wind through the trees. "Why do they love me but fear and hate you?" Death was silent for a long moment, the tip of his scythe resting against the ground. His hollow eyes gazed at the mortals, and his voice, when he spoke, was deep and resonant, like the toll of a bell. "Because, dear Life," he replied, "you are a beautiful lie, and I am the ugly truth." Life's expression faltered. "A lie? How can you say that? I bring them happiness, purpose, and hope. What lie is there in that?" Death turned his gaze toward her, his bony fingers tightening around the scythe. "You give them the illusion that they will last forever. You make them believe that their joys, their triumphs, and their love are eternal. But I am the reminder that nothing lasts, that all things, no matter how beautiful, must come to an end." The mortals below continued their celebration, oblivious to the two celestial beings watching over them. Life sighed, stepping into the meadow, her bare feet brushing the grass. Wherever she walked, flowers bloomed in her wake, vibrant and full of color. She twirled gracefully, her gown glistening like sunlight on water. "Do you see their smiles?" she asked, glancing back at Death. "Do you feel their joy? They do not hate me because I give them something worth cherishing." Death followed her, his every step withering the flowers she had created. The grass beneath him turned to ash, and the air grew colder. "And yet," he said, "those smiles fade when they see me approach. The joy you give is fleeting, and they curse me for taking it away." Life paused, turning to face him. "Perhaps they fear you because they do not understand you." Death tilted his head, his empty sockets locking onto her radiant face. "They do not wish to understand me. To them, I am the thief of their happiness. They beg for more time, as if I am the villain in their story. But I am not cruel, life. I am fair. I take all, young or old, rich or poor. No one escapes me. The two stood together in the center of the meadow, their opposing natures blending in a strange, harmonious tension. Life placed a gentle hand on death's bony arm. Perhaps they fear you because you are their reminder that their time is precious, that what I give them is not to be taken for granted. Death stared at her hand, then at her eyes, which shimmered with a kindness that he had never known. And perhaps they love you because you blind them to my truth, he said. You make them forget their fragility, their mortality. You are the dream they long to remain in, while I am the awakening they dread. Life smiled softly. And yet, without me, they would have no joy to lose. And without you, they would have no reason to cherish it. For the first time in millennia, Death lowered his scythe and nodded. You and I are two sides of the same coin. They may hate me, but I will always follow you, for we are bound together. Where there is life, there must be death. As the mortals below continued their lives, laughing, loving, and dreaming, life and death resumed their eternal dance. Life, with her light and joy, moved through the world, creating moments of beauty. And death, silent and somber, followed her, ensuring that each story reached its inevitable end. Though mortals might love one and despise the other, the truth remained. Neither could exist without the other. And so they walked together, eternal companions, bound by the delicate balance of existence itself. Story 9. The Demon's Curse. In the shadow depths of the Forgotten Valley, a tale of terror was whispered among the villagers. It spoke of a demoness named Lilitha, a cursed being who once walked among mortals but was damned for her sins. Her image, with pale skin, piercing red eyes, and horns that glistened like obsidian, haunted their dreams. No one knew the full truth of her origin, but they all agreed on one thing. The demoness was a harbinger of doom. Every century, she awakened from her slumber to seek vengeance, her rage fueled by the betrayal that had condemned her to darkness. Centuries ago, Lilitha had been a powerful sorceress, beloved and feared in equal measure. She was known for her beauty and her mastery of magic, but her heart belonged to one person, Erasmus, the Lord of the Kingdom. He promised her love, loyalty, and a throne by his side. But Erasmus betrayed her. Afraid of her growing power and influence, he conspired with the kingdom's clergy to denounce her as a witch. On a cold, moonless night, she was dragged from her home, her screams echoing through the village. They bound her to a stake, her wrists bleeding from the iron chains, and set her aflame under the guise of purification. As the flames consumed her, Lilitha's cries turned into curses. Her voice, now otherworldly, swore vengeance upon Erasmus and all who had betrayed her. You will burn as I have burned. You will know the pain of eternal torment. I will return. The fire should have destroyed her, but instead, it transformed her. The dark forces she had once wielded in secret now became her essence. Her beauty turned monstrous, her skin ashen, her eyes like pools of blood, and horns erupting from her skull. Lilitha became something far worse than a sorceress. She became a demon. In the present day, the village lived in fear of the curse. Every 100 years, when the blood moon rose, Lilitha's spirit would return to claim vengeance. Stories of entire families disappearing overnight, livestock slaughtered, and crops withering in moments were told with trembling voices. The villagers had built a shrine at the site of her execution, leaving offerings in a desperate attempt to appease her wrath. But the blood moon had risen again. That night, a traveler named Evelyn arrived in the village. She was a historian, drawn to the tales of Lilitha and the mysterious valley. The villagers begged her to leave, warning her of the demoness's return. But Evelyn dismissed their fears as superstition. Armed with her journal and a lantern, she ventured to the ruins of the shrine. The air grew colder with every step, the light of the blood moon casting long, distorted shadows. When she reached the site, she found the broken remains of the stake where Lilitha had burned, now surrounded by withered flowers and melted candles. Evelyn knelt to inspect the ground, but as she did, the earth beneath her trembled. A low, guttural growl echoed through the valley, and the air became suffocatingly heavy. The lantern's flame flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. When she looked up, Lilitha was there. The demoness stepped from the shadows, her eyes burning like embers, her presence radiating malice. Her voice was a blend of silk and venom. "You dare disturb my slumber, mortal?" Evelyn scrambled backward, her heart pounding. I didn't mean to," she stammered. Lilitha tilted her head, her expression both curious and predatory. "Do you seek the truth of my story? Or are you another fool come to mock me as they did?" Evelyn swallowed her fear and steadied her voice. "I only wish to understand. Why do you curse this land? Why do you torment these people?" The demoness laughed, a sound that sent shivers down Evelyn's spine. "They are the descendants of the ones who betrayed me. Their blood carries the stain of their ancestors' sins. I am their reckoning." "But they had nothing to do with what happened to you," Evelyn pleaded. "They're innocent." Lilitha's expression darkened. "Innocent? Just as I was innocent when they lit the flames beneath me? No, mortal. There is no innocence, only justice." Evelyn knew she couldn't defeat Lilitha, but perhaps she could reason with her. What if you could be free of this pain? What if your vengeance didn't have to define you? Lilitha sneered. "Freedom? There is no freedom for the damned." "There is always a choice," Evelyn insisted. She reached into her bag and pulled out an ancient relic, a small obsidian mirror etched with runes. "This mirror can trap the souls of the cursed. Let me use it to free you from this torment." The demoness paused, her fiery eyes narrowing. For a moment, Evelyn thought she saw something human in Lilitha's gaze, something fragile and broken, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "You offer me imprisonment under the guise of salvation?" Lilitha hissed. "Do you think me a fool?" Evelyn barely had time to react as Lilitha lunged, her claws slashing through the air. She held up the mirror, and a blinding light erupted from its surface, enveloping them both. When Evelyn awoke, she was alone. The shrine was silent, the air still. The blood moon had faded, and the first light of dawn bathed the valley in a soft glow. She looked at the mirror, now cracked and dark, its runes dim. Had she succeeded? Had she trapped Lilitha's soul and ended the curse? As she turned to leave, a whisper drifted through the air, sending a chill down her spine. "You cannot trap the storm, mortal. I am eternal." Evelyn fled the valley, but the memory of Lilitha's haunting gaze stayed with her forever. And the villagers? They found the shrine untouched the next day, save for a single new carving on the ancient stake. The blood moon will rise again. Story 10. The Bone Collector. Deep in the shadowy swamps of Blackthorn Hollow, a legend circulated among the townsfolk. A tale so dark that even the bravest souls dared not speak of it after sundown. They called him the Bone Collector, a spectral figure who wandered the foggy marshes, clad in tattered black, his eyes glowing like embers of hellfire. He was said to carry a staff crowned with a human skull and adorned with chains that rattled like whispers of the damned. The Bone Collector wasn't merely a ghost. He was a necromancer cursed to forever roam the earth, hunting for bones to fuel his dark rituals. Where he walked, the dead stirred and the living fled. The swamp was his domain, a labyrinth of decay and despair where none dared to tread. Centuries ago, the man who would become the Bone Collector was known as Ezekiel Varn, a feared warlock who dabbled in forbidden magics. Ezekiel was consumed by an obsession to master death itself. He believed that by collecting the bones of the dead, he could summon their spirits and control them. Villages across the land were terrorized by his presence, their graveyards desecrated and their dead stolen in the night. But Ezekiel's dark ambitions drew the ire of the church and the wrath of a local coven of witches. They banded together to confront him in the heart of Blackthorn Hollow. In a final act of defiance, Ezekiel unleashed a spell to bind his soul to his staff, ensuring that even in death, he would live on. The coven's curse backfired, trapping him in a state between life and death, his body rotting but his soul immortal. For centuries, Ezekiel, now the Bone Collector, wandered the swamp, bound to his unholy purpose. His staff grew heavier with each soul it claimed, its power darkening the very land around it. The swamp became a place of dread, its twisted trees and murky waters hiding secrets too horrifying to uncover. On Halloween night, a group of teenagers, Lucas, Maya, Dean, and Rachel, found themselves at the edge of Blackthorn Hollow. They had heard the stories, of course, but they were young, bold, and foolish. They wanted to prove the legend wrong, to capture something supernatural on their phones for their followers online. "Come on," Lucas said, holding up his camera. "It's just a swamp. No one's ever actually seen this Bone Collector." Rachel hesitated, the fear in her eyes unmistakable. Maybe no one's seen him because no one's ever come back. Dean smirked. "What's the worst that can happen? We get a little wet?" Against their better judgment, they entered the swamp. The air grew colder, the fog thicker with every step. The trees loomed like skeletal sentinels, their gnarled branches dripping with moss. The ground squelched beneath their feet, and the sound of distant water dripping echoed eerily. Hours passed, and the group found themselves hopelessly lost. The swamp seemed to twist and change around them, leading them in circles. Lucas's camera battery drained inexplicably, and Rachel swore she heard whispers in the fog, soft, chilling voices calling her name. Then they heard it, the faint rattle of chains. "Did you hear that?" Maya whispered, clutching Dean's arm. "It's probably just the wind," he replied, though his voice wavered. The sound grew louder, closer. The fog parted, and there he was. The Bone Collector. He stood tall, his skeletal frame draped in rotting leather and chains. His staff, crowned with a leering skull, pulsed with a sickly green light. His eyes, glowing red, fixed on them with an intensity that froze them in place. "You dare disturb my domain?" His voice rasped, like the creak of ancient wood. Lucas dropped his camera, his hands trembling. We didn't mean to." "Silence," the Bone Collector growled. He raised his staff, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. The earth split open, revealing bones, dozens, hundreds, rising from the muck. They assembled themselves into grotesque shapes, forming skeletal beasts that circled the group, their hollow eyes glowing with malice. "You come seeking stories?" Ezekiel hissed. "Let me give you one." With a wave of his staff, the skeletal creatures lunged. Maya screamed as one grabbed her, its bony fingers pulling her toward the swamp's dark waters. Dean swung a fallen branch at another, but it shattered uselessly against its skull. Rachel fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Please, we're sorry. Let us go." The bone collector paused, his fiery gaze settling on her. "There is no forgiveness for trespassers, only bones for my collection." Desperate, Lucas remembered the lighter in his pocket. He grabbed it and set fire to a nearby cluster of moss. The flames flared briefly, illuminating the swamp. The skeletal beasts recoiled, their forms faltering. The bone collector snarled, raising his staff to extinguish the fire, but Rachel seized the moment. She grabbed Lucas's dropped camera and hurled it at the skull atop Ezekiel's staff. The skull shattered, and a deafening roar filled the swamp as the bone collector staggered. Without his staff, Ezekiel seemed weakened, his form flickering like a dying flame. "You cannot destroy me," he roared. "I am eternal." The group didn't wait to find out if he was right. They ran, their hearts pounding, the swamp seeming to close in around them. The rattling of chains and the growls of skeletal creatures echoed behind them, but they didn't look back. When they finally emerged from the swamp, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. They collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air. None of them spoke. The terror of what they had seen rendered them silent. Days later, the town buzzed with the story of the teenagers who had dared to enter Blackthorn Hollow. Lucas's footage, though fragmented and corrupted, became a sensation. But the bone collector's curse wasn't broken. Back in the swamp, the shattered skull atop his staff slowly reformed. Ezekiel Varn, the bone collector, stood once more, his red eyes burning brighter than ever. And the swamp waited, hungry for its next trespassers.